Well, I hope you all enjoyed your wonderful lunch. Let's have a round of applause for the soup makers. Why don't you stand up if you made soup for this month's Lunch and Learn? Come on, soup makers, stand up. That's very good. Thank you all very much. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rabbi Jesse Paikin. Rabbi Paikin is the executive director of BASE, a national movement of home-based, pluralistic, rabbinic-led communities for young adults. He recently served as a research fellow for M2, the Institute for Experimental Jewish Education, where he researched and designed new pedagogies to influence the ways that Jewish educators teach. But probably the thing that he's most proud of is his daughter, Ruthie, and as we all know, his wife, Rabbi Crawley, our own Rabbi Crawley. So please let's join me in welcoming Rabbi Paikin.
Everyone, it's really, I'm already doing something wrong with it. I haven't even touched it. Okay, we're great. It's really such a pleasure to be here with everyone. I've heard a lot about Lunch and Learn over the years, and I was just so delighted and honored that I was asked to spend some time here learning with each other. I'll talk in a minute, just as we're starting, about what it is that we're going to learn. You saw the blurb and all of that. But I'm going to hand out some printed text sheets of some of the texts that we're going to be looking at together. Everything's going to be up on the screen, and if you're on Zoom right now, you'll see everything on the screen also. So you don't need one, but if you want to follow along in print or make notes, and the texts also have original languages. So we're going to look at stuff in Hebrew and Aramaic, so that's on here, but what we'll do is in English. So if you feel like you want to spend some time in multiple languages, they're on here. Okay. All right. I want to, as we're starting off, I want to share just like a few teachings and choice nuggets from our tradition about memory, and particularly about forgetfulness, right? Which is the topic that we're going to be looking at. Some of these I've been sitting with for quite some time and thinking about it, and others literally I saw in the Machzor over Rosh Hashanah and thought, oh, wow, that's relevant and so timely, and I put them up here. So the Baal Shem Tov, the 18th century founder of Hasidic Judaism, taught forgetfulness leads to exile, while remembrance is the secret of redemption. And like, if that's a nice bumper sticker, if you can imagine, like on a horse and cart, maybe in Ukraine in the 18th century. But like, just zoom in on it in your head for a second and think about, like, forgetfulness leads to exile. When we say exile in Judaism, that's like a very coded word, right? It doesn't just mean kind of being away from somewhere where you want to be. There's an idea of like being away from the core of who we are and what we are. And when we say redemption, that doesn't just mean kind of getting back or winning. There really is a universal message of redemption, of kind of we've achieved the arc of history, right? And so I wonder, what was the Baal Shem Tov thinking and talking about when he said that forgetfulness leads you to exile, okay? And remembrance equals redemption. So that's, we could just we could leave that there and we could be done for the day, right? Or how about this one? To us, recollection is a holy act. We sanctify the present by remembering the past. To us Jews, the essence of faith is memory. To believe is to remember. That's Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. You can kind of just hear it. If you've read Heschel, you can, even if you didn't know it was him, you would probably know it was him. He like makes these grand sweeping statements, right? But just pay attention. He says recollection is a holy act, and that you might just think the word holy is an adjective there, but it's not just a nice word. He's saying that there is something divine or religious or elevating beyond just the ordinary, right? It's extraordinary, this idea of remembering, right? To believe is to remember. Faith is memory. He's making quite powerful statements. Or how about this one by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who's the 20th and 21st century Jewish historian and rabbi in New York, taught at Columbia University. He says, Judaism is the technology of memory. Right? Now, what's he saying? All of Judaism exists to remember. So Judaism itself is a technology of memory, a set of practices designed to make the past present, something to make the past present. So we could, again, like I said, just kind of leave these things here and feel very comfortable and proud of ourselves for understanding that memory is important, remembering is important in Judaism, and that there, as a result of that, forgetting is something that we should avoid. Right? We could do that. We could be very satisfied. But it would be too easy, I think, just to do that. And it would be too easy for me just to teach about the importance of memory, to tell you why memory is important, to teach about the ideas and rituals in Judaism that lead towards memory. I don't take it for granted, but it's so foundational and fundamental. And that's why I brought some of these teachings here from three very different kinds of people to illustrate that I just assume it to be the bedrock principle of much of Judaism. Right? The injunction to remember, it is just absolutely unconditional. And even still, given that, and while I'm saying this, I'm remembering that I need a little bit more room here. So I'm just going to do this, and hopefully, you'll forgive me if like this paper's flying everywhere. Every year we commit and we recommit to this idea about memory, right? Rosh Hashanah is called Yom HaZikaron. We tend not to use that name. Yom HaZikaron means Remembrance Day. And we tend not to do that because that also happens to be the name of another Jewish observance, a modern Israeli commemoration. But when you read the Torah, the holiday has several names, and one of them is Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day. And so where does that come from? Why would we call that day about remembrance? Is it a remembrance of who we are and who we aspire to be, of our commitments to each other, of our commitments to God, probably all of those things. And one of the things that we'll do today is try to uncover not the answers to those specific questions, but really the underlying value, right? What is at stake if we don't do this, right? What is at stake if we forget? And we're going to do this by looking at several rabbinic teachings from thousands of years ago, because that's the headspace that I often live in when thinking about Jewish text and tradition. And we're really going to look at some formative rabbinic teachings that illustrate how memory builds collective identity, right? How it's not just something that each of us owns on our own, but something that we do all together. And as I mentioned, instead of talking about remembering, we're going to use this opportunity to ask the inverse question. If we don't do this thing that we say is important, what happens? What happens if, God forbid, we forget the things that we're supposed to remember? We're going to do this primarily by looking at one story from the Talmud that is, frankly, it's quite vivid and shocking and very short, and will hopefully rouse us all at this time of remembrance. Just a word on the Talmud. What is the Talmud? It is one of the earliest collections of rabbinic teachings and law and commentary on an earlier text on the earliest codification of Jewish law. And so when you open up the Talmud, you're reading roughly, let's say, 500 to 800 years of Jewish wisdom from the earliest rabbinic periods, composed both in the land of Israel around the year 0, and then later in Sasanian Persia, for those who are really into kind of Central Asian geopolitics. That's a separate matter. Everything that you could want to know about Judaism can be found and sourced within the Talmud. So when we quote from the Talmud, we're doing it because it's really kind of the backbone of all of Jewish law and practice and ritual. So I should qualify at the outset that what the text that we're going to be looking at doesn't legislate memory. Right? It doesn't say thou shalt remember. And I think it's also worth saying at the outset that the very idea of memory can change. Each of us remembers differently over time. There's a lot of scholarship and really fascinating insight into what it actually means to remember. And I think it's also worth saying that certain moments call for certain kinds of memories, right? In a broader sense, what is remembered and who gets to decide that is at least as important as why we should remember. I'm not going to talk about those things, but I just wanted to say it would feel inauthentic to start talking about memory without acknowledging that, like, well, who gets to decide what it is that we should remember? Having said all that, the story that we're going to look at really, for me, reaches through time with questions that should grab at us and compel us to think about why we remember, why we act and behave in the world in the ways that we do. And at its core, that's what the Talmud does best, right? Is tries to answer the question why, which appears on almost every single page of the Talmud. And if we take this story seriously, I think it asks some of the most important questions in life, and the same kinds of questions that this time of year, the Yamim Noraim, the High Holy Days, asks of us. Questions like, what is our role as individuals and as a community to engage in acts of remembrance? How does memory build collective identity and then become culturally defining? And then who do we need around us, right? If this is something that we're not just doing on our own in isolation, well, who do we want around us to help us do that? And how do we then have to act with those people, right? Once we've said it's not something I'm doing alone, but it's something I'm doing with people around me, that raises all sorts of ethical questions of, well, how do I see myself in relationship to those people? How do we nurture our shared identity? And then the big question, what's at stake if we forget? Okay, so a little bit of background on the story that we're going to read. The Talmudic story is from the section of the Talmud that deals with the laws of Shabbat, specifically from a chapter that asks, what is permitted and what is prohibited when it comes to washing or anointing yourself on Shabbat? That's also a whole separate question that we're not even going to touch at all, but it's just as background. So the Talmud has a question. Are you allowed to give yourself a bath on Shabbat? Can you anoint yourself with oils or with waters? That's happening in the background. Okay, that's the background. And just as the Talmud is getting to the story that it's about to tell, it's in the middle of asking and considering, are you allowed on Shabbat to go to a public bath or a hot spring? Remember where this is written. This is written about 2,000 years ago in the land of Israel. It's Roman occupied. There are lots of public baths everywhere. They're very nice. Maybe some of you who have been to Israel have seen the ruins of some of them. And the rabbis want to know, can you go there on Shabbat? Are you allowed to do that? Right? So that's the question. And they're actually not talking about a hot spring in Israel, in the land of Israel. They're asking about a hot spring somewhere else, a little bit further away. It's still in the neighborhood, in the Anatolian region of Perugaita. That's how the Talmud refers to it. In, I guess, Greek, I think it's Greek. It would be Phrygia, right in the middle here, in what's today Turkey. And the rabbis want to know, can you go there, right? Is it okay? Can I go to these? I hear there's very nice hot springs there. Am I allowed to go there? That's what they want to know. And in the middle of this halachic legal discussion, the rabbis take a left turn and tell the story that we're going to read. It is deceptively lush. It's very short. And because it's so brief, I want to read it here in full, all the way through. And then we'll rewind and kind of examine the little bits of it a little bit more closely. We'll learn about all the characters who are involved, including some surprising hidden backstories, which are played out in parallel texts across Jewish literature. My advice to you is don't worry if any pieces don't quite make sense. Just pay attention to the general contours and the drama of this story. Does that sound okay? Okay, here we go. This is text one, if you want to follow along. I'm going to put it up on the screen. We start off with a rabbi named Rabbi Chelbo. And Rabbi Chelbo said, the wine of Perugaita and the water of the Deyomsit deprived Israel of the 10 lost tribes. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach happened to come to Perugaita, and he was drawn to them, and his learning was uprooted. When he returned, he stood to read from a Torah scroll, and he was supposed to read the verse, HaChodesh hazeh lachem, this month shall be for you, from the book of Exodus. But instead he read, HaCheresh haya libam, which means have their hearts become deaf, which is not from anywhere. The sages asked for God to have mercy on him, and his learning was restored. And that is why we learned Rabbi Nehorai says, Exile yourself to a place of Torah, and do not say that it will follow you, as if your colleagues will establish it in your hands, and do not rely on your understanding alone. It's the whole story. Let's just go back a little bit here. Deomsit is one of these hot springs, right? Perugaita, that's the region that we mentioned up in Phrygia in modern day Turkey, right? Okay. So we can outline this text into three really nice subunits, which align very, very nicely with the themes of the text. So first, we have a prequel about the significance of Perugaita, right? This place that apparently caused the loss of the 10 tribes. We'll say a word about that in a second. Then there's the body of the story, right? Rabbi Elazar goes to Perugaita and loses his knowledge, and all goes away. And then the moral of the story, where the rabbis of the Talmud quote from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, which I know Mike has spent lots of time studying, a much earlier text. And the rabbis of the Talmud then quote from it and kind of insert it in here a little bit. Okay, so let's dive in and read the story. Let's zoom in. Rabbi Chelbo said, the wine of Perugaita and the water of the Deomsit deprived Israel of the 10 lost tribes. So what's so bad about Perugaita, right? What's so bad about this Deomsit, this hot spring bathhouse that's there? So just a word about this region in Anatolia. Historically, Perugaita had a large population of Jews, Christians, and Jewish Christians, which was an early kind of sect of Judaism. And the Christian Bible actually records Paul of Tarshish, having visited there. And what do we know from that? That this was a heavily assimilated Jewish community. The Jewish residents had apparently lost their connection to the land of Israel. They were no longer able to speak Hebrew, and they didn't have a lot of Jewish education, especially when compared to other diaspora brethren. So by this point in Jewish history, there's lots of Jewish communities that aren't in the land of Israel. And when you compare them to other places like Alexandria in Egypt, for example, that's a very learned Jewish community. But there's something about Perugaita where the Jews are heavily assimilated and have lost their kind of cultural, linguistic, and religious education, right? And as a result, the Jews who are living there are much more readily converted to Christianity once the Christians come along and are starting to look to kind of convert people in this universalizing tradition. So Rabbi Chelbo's attack that the waters of the bathhouse specifically instigated the disappearance of the 10 lost tribes is also a little bit curious, right? There's not necessarily a connection here between this part of the world and the 10 lost tribes. There's not necessarily a connection between the Jewish community that's in Perugaita and the 10 lost tribes. It's not really apparent immediately. It might reflect like this awareness of the apostasy of the Jews who are living there. Rabbi Chelbo probably knew about the Jews who lived there and might have just been trying to like launch an attack against them. But then the question we would want to ask is, why is this in the Talmud, right? Why is this story included here? Whoever edited the Talmud put this in for a reason. And Rabbi Chelbo doesn't appear as a character in the rest of the story. He disappears. We don't know anything else about him. So he's basically like just giving this offhand insult and then disappearing. So when the editors of the Talmud put this in the wider story, we want to ask, like, what do they want us to know? Why is this here? So to help with that a little bit, let's look at what we know a little bit about these the 10 lost tribes and how Jews have tried to understand this historical event over time. So this is from the second book of Kings, from chapter 17. Just going to look very shortly at this. This is a recounting of the Jews getting exiled from the land of Israel. Then the king of Assyria marched against the whole land. He came to Samaria, which is the northern kingdom of Israel, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halal at the river Habor, at the river Gozan, and the towns of Medea. A very tragic event in our history. And then the Tanakh goes on to say, why did this happen? Because the Israelites sinned against God, who had freed them from the land of Egypt, from the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And what did they do to repay God? They worshipped other gods. They followed the customs of other nations. And this is why God dispossesses them from the land and allows the king of Assyria to come in and exile everybody. So the Tanakh depicts this loss of the 10 tribes in militaristic terms, right? How does it happen? By a foreign invader king coming in, occupying the land, and then exiling the Jews out of the land. There's a theological frame, right? Why did this happen? It happened because we sinned against God. But the way it happens is through military conflicts, right? Through history. So the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is trying to understand this event, this military defeat, and kind of contextualize it in a theological frame. The way it happens is through human history, right? It's not God who comes down and kicks us out, right? The same way that kind of God redeemed us from Egypt. This is a human king who conquers the land and kicks us out. So that's one of the earliest ways to try and grapple with this event. But we can see that over time, there are other ways that Jews try to grapple with this. So this is also from the Babylonian Talmud. This is text number 3. By the time we get into the Talmud, the rabbis are still trying to understand this. And there's a debate over whether or not the tribes will ever return. And the rabbis are trying to understand this catastrophic loss, right? This is what they say. The 10 tribes are not destined to return, as it is stated in the book of Deuteronomy. God cast them into another land, as it is this day. Right? And then we get a nice little kind of commentary or a midrash on why does it say day, right? In Deuteronomy, by the way, the 10 tribes have not been exiled yet. So the rabbis are kind of doing something that's a little wishy-washy with time here, but they get to do that. And so they're going to give a little drash on the word day. Just as the day goes away and never comes back, so too do the 10 tribes go into exile and don't return. That's Rabbi Akiva who says that. But Rabbi Eliezer has something different to say. He says, as it is this day. Well, what else do we know about the day? It gets dark and then it gets bright in the morning. And that will be for the 10 tribes as well. It's dark for them now and it's destined to brighten. So you see a little debate here as to whether or not this historical tragedy will ever be resolved. Akiva thinks no, this is it. This is kind of what it means to be Jewish now. Rabbi Eliezer looks at this more optimistically. He says, no, we know things get better, right? It's dark and it'll get bright. Later on, the rabbis try and interpret this. The earlier comments, they're still trying to grapple with this. When we move through this text, we're jumping forward about 500 to 600 years in history. And the later rabbis are still trying to debate this. One says the 10 tribes have no share in the world to come. Right now, we're not even talking about kind of history. Now we're talking about like cosmology, right? It's not just that they got exiled. Now it's that they don't even get eternal life in the world to come. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda of the village of Akko says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, different Rabbi Shimon, if their actions continue, they don't return. And if not, they do return. So Rabbi Shimon here is saying, well, like if the 10 tribes who are off living in exile repent, then they can come back. But if not, then they're still going to get punished. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, so the third opinion here, says they come to the world to come, meaning, yeah, okay, they may not get to come back to the land of Israel, but they do get eternal life. And Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Akiva, remember what Akiva said? He said, no, once they're gone, they're gone. And he said, he's being uncharacteristically harsh here. So we get 4 different opinions. One of them is that they're never coming back. The second one is that they can come back, but only if they repent. The third one is that they don't get to come back, but they get to live in kind of heaven or wherever in the world to come. And the fourth opinion is like, God, you guys are being so harsh here. This is the fourth opinion. But watch what's happening here, right? All of these rabbis are trying to grapple with how do we understand this historical trauma, right? Do I look at it through historical terms? Do I look at it through spiritual terms? Rabbi Bar Chana on the bottom there is kind of looking at this like psychologically, right? Like, can we be a little more gentle with each other here and understanding what this happened? They're still hundreds of years later trying to grapple with the impact of this historical trauma. As history continues and we leave the period of the Talmud, the rabbis are still trying to understand this event, this exile of the 10 tribes. And an idea grows that the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes, had not just gone off the derech. Like they didn't just like start becoming like, naughty when it comes to monotheism, but that they were actually just like, they had completely abandoned their Jewish obligations. They were engaging in idolatry and they were living this wild life of like drunkenness and gorging and excess food and over-consuming materialistically, and that this was all done in public, right? Presumably influencing others. This idea grows. Let's look at this text here. This is text number 4 by a rabbi named, he's known as the Radak, which is an acronym for Rabbi David Kimchi, not Kimchi. He's from France, not the Far East. He's a 12th and 13th century rabbi. And this is his commentary about what happened in the Northern Kingdom. He said that they were eating and drinking to their heart's content, delighting in oils and fragrances until they were drunk and vomiting on the streets like alcoholics. They solely went after earthly pleasures and forgot about God and mitzvot. And let's look at another text. This is by Rashi, also 12th century or 11th century French rabbi, one of the most influential commentators on Tanakh. And when he's commenting on the 10 lost tribes, he says they were hedonists and they occupied themselves with that rather than occupying themselves with Torah, and they went out to an evil culture. So Rashi, in his commentary, he lays out his antipathy towards this Hellenization without holding back, right? No holds barred from him. So there's an association that grows over time that as the 10 tribes get abandoned to history, that they kind of like had it coming, right? That they did this to themselves. And the way they did this to themselves was by adopting like this very Greek, Hellenized, debaucherous, hedonistic lifestyle. Okay. Keep all of that in the back of your head, and let's go back and look at our text, right? And ask what's going on with the 10 tribes and this place in Perugaita and the hot springs there, right? We know that this is a city, an area where lots of Jews live there who have become Hellenized and acculturated, assimilated. And it's not a good place, right? Chelbo does not like this place. It's hedonistic. It's almost kind of like stereotypically Greek, right? Which influenced the behavior that led to the loss of the tribes, this really catastrophic loss that happens up there. And so now we get a little bit more of a window into why in the Talmud there's such like hatred and antipathy towards Perugaita and its bathhouses, and why the rabbis want to say, no, you don't get to go there. You don't. And that it's not just something that happened in the past to the loss of the 10 tribes, but that's about to happen again to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, right? Which is why we need to be afraid of this place. So the question why we should even be concerned about like this kind of cultural background might be something you're thinking about. And there's a rabbi, his name's Jay Kelman, and he argues that the kind of the upshot of all of this is that for people whose primary focus is kind of this worldly pleasure, you're almost unable to continue the chain of Jewish history, which often requires sublimation to something bigger than this. And if all I'm doing is focusing on achieving my own desires in the moment, I'm not going to be able to do that. It's not that Judaism's opposed to pleasure or to happiness, but the hedonism of Perugaita and the bathhouses represents elevating the self above everything else. And the rabbis, I'd argue Judaism as a whole also, is vehemently opposed to this, right? And as an idea, it's really the antithesis of what we are supposed to do, which is to understand ourselves in relationship to each other and to something bigger than us, which the rabbis would certainly call God, right? And as we'll see, the kind of negating of that has tragic consequences in our story. So there's an invitation here at this point in the story to ask ourselves a few questions. Really one question. What are the different ways that we can work with the memory of traumatic events in our collective? Obviously, a question I know lots of us are grappling with in this moment. And one of the reasons I think this story is so useful, and hopefully we're already starting to see some sparks of how it might enable us to think about this question of how do I take this awful thing that happened in the past and try and contextualize it and understand it? Do I want to build a wall off and say, I don't want to go anywhere near that? It's dangerous, right? as Rabbi Chelbo kind of says. Or do we want to grapple a little bit with what's behind the surface there, like we saw the rabbis doing it over time, trying to get maybe a little bit closer and ask some questions, right? How do different people use memory in different ways? In the Talmud, the rabbis are anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years after the fact, after the exile of the tribes. And they're still trying to figure it out. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years later, they're still trying to figure it out. And right now, at this moment, we're trying to grapple with the loss and sacrifices from a year ago. So how long does it take to get solely from just a historical memory, or we might say what happened, to grappling with the bigger ethical and spiritual implications? For the rabbis, it takes like 1,000 years. Okay, so our second section in the story has like 3 kind of mini subunits. First, we're introduced to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach and his travels to Perugaita. Then he goes back to Eretz Yisrael and he loses his memory. And then his fellows, the fellow sages, they pray for him and his learning is restored. So I mentioned earlier that there's a substantial backstory. There's kind of like a hidden story to his life, which is played out in some other parallel texts in our tradition. So let's just take a look at them to round out our understanding of who's this guy, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. So he's the subject of several well-known sayings in Pirkei Avot, including the following. This is text number 6. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, hey, that's a Greek name. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, Rabbi Yossi the priest, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. And he would recount their praises. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is a cistern covered in plaster that does not lose a drop. Bless you. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, happy is the one who gave birth to him. Rabbi Yossi the priest is pious. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel fears sin. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is an overflowing spring. This is the one we care about. This is our rabbi. He's the overflowing spring, a Mayan Hamit Gaber. Abba Shaul, he's also a rabbi, said in his name, that if all the sages of Israel were on one side of a scale and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach were on the other side, he would outweigh them all. You know, he's a nice guy. You might want to meet him, right? But there's 2 metaphors here to pay attention to, okay? Rabbi Eliezer is a waterproof cistern, and Elazar ben Arach is an overflowing spring. These are particularly vivid metaphors if you live in the land of Israel, which is doesn't have a lot of natural water and so needs to collect water, right? So the metaphors are very intentional, and they represent 2 pedagogies of what it means to learn. Right? One is the plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop and preserves tradition that's transmitted from one generation to the next. Right? And we know this when we look into Rabbi Eliezer, right? He took pride in never saying anything that he had never heard directly from his teachers. He always quotes his teachers. That's on one side, right? He's a good conservator of the tradition. And on the other hand, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach is described as an overflowing spring, one in whom everything wells up and bursts forth. He's an innovator and he's creative. He has argumentative power to enhance other people's learning. And that's the one that kind of carries the big weight in this story, right? And this beautifully captures a debate that extends through the entire Talmud and through much of Judaism. How do we balance rote learning and understanding of Jewish tradition and practice with creativity? How do I balance these out? I'll give you a secret. There's never a clear answer, right? Which means we have to do both, right? You need to both preserve the tradition and innovate and create. But here in our story, we know that the emphasis is on the creative, overflowing wellspring of tradition, right? And think about just like how beautifully poetically constructed this is. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, his nickname is Mayan Hamit Gaber, the overflowing spring. And in this story, what does he do? He goes off to the hot springs, right? It's like so beautifully constructed, but he goes off to somewhere that should be off limits. He's not supposed to go there. It's not a particularly good place for him, particularly as this like the greatest scholar in all of Israel, right? And what happens when he goes there, this dramatic event on which the whole story is built, is the erasure from his mind of all of his knowledge. He happens to come to Perugaita. He was drawn there. It's very nice, it's very Greek. And his learning is uprooted, right? It's ripped out of him. We sense the power, the magical pull of this attractive foreign culture, and in an instant, his knowledge is gone. But why is he going there in the first place, right? If he's like one of the greatest sages of Israel, why does he want to go there? Well, you know, secular culture can be like really attractive, right? You might want to go there. It's pretty nice. Beyond the historical infamy, which we took a look at, Perugaita has some additional relevance, which we can uncover if we look at a couple parallel texts. Okay? This is from a commentary on Pirkei Avot. This is text number 7. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch said, I will go to Deomsit, to a beautiful place with beautiful and pleasant waters. And his fellow sages say, let's go to Yavne, to a place with many scholars who love Torah. And the one who went to Deomsit, Elazar ben Aruch, to the beautiful place with beautiful and pleasant waters, his name was diminished in Torah. But the ones who went to Yavne, to a place with many scholars who love Torah, their names became great. So it's a parallel story. You see, it's like very similar. It's clearly drawing on the same tradition, but there's a couple of differences. One, we hear like, why does he want to go there? Oh, because it's beautiful and it's pleasant. And two, in this one, he says, I'm going there. In our story from the Talmud, he just happened to show up there, right? He was traveling along and, oh, maybe I'll stop into the hot springs. But in this parallel story, he himself decides to go there. And it's contrasted with Yavne. Yavne is very important. Yavne is the site of like the first Beit Midrash, like the first house of study in Judaism. It's where, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, the remnants of the earliest rabbis of rabbinic Judaism go to Yavne and build the Judaism that we recognize today there. It comes from Yavne. So when you say Yavne, it means like Jewish learning, right? It's the center of Jewish learning. And so now it's not just that he happened upon Perugaita, he could have gone to like the capital city of Rabbi, but he didn't. He goes off to this Greek bath hot spring. So this is a little bit more of an indictment of him. And we have another parallel text. This comes from a book called Kohelet Rabbah, which is a midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes. And here, this should sound a little bit familiar to you. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. All the time that he was alive, they sat before him. When he died, they went to Yavne, but Rabbi Elazar, our rabbi, followed his wife to Emmaus, a place with beautiful waters and a beautiful view. He waited for them to come after him, but they didn't come. Since they didn't come to him, he wanted to go after them, but his wife didn't let him. She said, hey, who needs whom? He said to her, they need me. And she gives him a parable. She said, a flask and mice. Whose way is to go to him? The mice to the flask or the flask to the mice? He listened to her and sat by himself until he forgot his learning. So clearly drawing on the same tradition here, I want to say, I think one of the things that's happening here is the later rabbis are a little bit uncomfortable with Elazar ben Aruch, this great rabbi, not looking so good. So what do? They write a story and they blame it on his wife. Sorry. I think that's a little bit of what's happening here. But look, there's some other layers here. So Emmaus, first of all, is a corruption of the text, and it's a little bit of a play on words. It's clearly a corruption of the Hebrew chamat, which means hot, the hot springs, right? So it's just over time become corrupted. But it's also very close to the Greek and Latin word for mouse, Emmaus, mouse, right? So the rabbis are kind of making a joke here, and there's a play on words of like, well, it kind of sounds like the hot springs, and it also sounds like mice, and apparently there's an association with mice and forgetfulness at some point in our tradition. You might think that's silly, but we do that with elephants, so whatever. I don't know the reason why, it's been lost to time, but they're trying to be a little cute and funny right here, but they're really trying to drive home the point that Elazar could have gone to the place of learning and with other people, with his fellow scholars, and instead he hangs out in this hedonistic place and just sits by himself alone, and that's what made him forget his learning. That's the thing, right? So remember what he's famous for. He's an overflowing spring. He's the innovator who doesn't just hold on to knowledge, but he bursts forth with it, right? You have to go to the cistern, to the flask, but he's not doing it, right? He's docile. He's just sitting there waiting for other people to come to him. There's a constant reminder here of who he's close to and who he's far from, and it underscores this crucial idea of distance from one's culture and our sources of memory and learning. Nachman Levine, a scholar, when he writes about this story, he teaches, when not in the company of his friends and colleagues, Rabbi Elazar becomes a small container of water, a flask, instead of the overflowing spring, losing even the traditions of the sealed cistern, which does not lose even a drop. So I'm thinking here about what it really means to remember. Is it just about repeating the stories and lessons and values that have been told to us? Partly, yeah. But it's not just about maintenance, but about furtherance, dedicating ourselves anew. And in our story here in the Talmud, Elazar ben Arach is unable to do that. He's lost his innate ability. He's completely forgotten. So now we have an understanding in our story of just how significant this particular location is and why Elazar ben Arach is portrayed the way he is. He was once renowned as a source of overflowing wisdom, a creative fountain, and now that he's far away from his people, he's forgotten it all. So the story continues with his return, having lost all of his learning, to the land of Israel, to the land of his fellow scholars. And as he ascends the bima to read from a Torah scroll, we get a rather poignant portrayal of what does it actually mean that he's lost all of his learning. And the Talmud does this to brilliant effect. When he returned, he stood to read from a Torah, and he was supposed to read HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this month shall be for you, from Exodus. But instead he read HaCheresh Haya Libam, have their hearts become deaf. And just a reminder that that means nothing. It's not quoted from anywhere. It's not actually a source. But I want you to see what the Talmud has done is quite genius. These are the two phrases in Hebrew. The top is HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, which is the quote from the book of Exodus. And underneath is what he winds up saying. And they look very similar. They look exceptionally similar. I hope you can see I've highlighted in red the letters that he flips. And the letters that he flips look very close to each other. It's a dalet and a resh, and a zayin and a yud, and a kaf and a bet. So this is the kind of mistake that like an elementary student might make. Not the greatest scholar on the scale of Judaism, right? And there's such like a cleverness too here, because HaChodesh, which was what he was supposed to say, which means month, also means new, right? Newness, innovation, creativity, right? A chiddush in our tradition is like an innovative teaching. And what's it replaced by? Cheresh, which means deafness, right? And the content of what he has misread, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, is also not an accident, right? It's not, the rabbis didn't just pick any verse, they picked a very specific verse for him to have mixed up. What is it? From Exodus, this month, this is text 9, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. And then a few verses later, this is Pesach, by the way. This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the eternal throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all time. A really important verse. It's establishing our commemoration of Pesach every year. This event of historical memory, probably like the Ur memory in Jewish kind of tradition, right? That's what he's forgotten, right? And it's such an important verse that Rashi, this is text 10, Rashi actually says this is the verse that should have started the whole Torah. When Rashi starts his commentary on the Torah on Genesis 1, he says this is not actually where the Torah should have started, right? The Torah should have started much later in the book of Exodus with the verse that we just read. Why? Because it's the first commandment that's given to the entire community of Israel. There are other commandments that come earlier, right? But this is the first one that everybody gets as a communal ensemble, right? So the verse that Rabbi Elazar ben Arach messes up, this month shall mark for you, it's like a very well-known part of Torah. And it's not only just a well-known one, but it's one whose very meaning is attributed to the role that communal memory plays. What would it mean to forget the Exodus? That's what he forgot. Not only the first mitzvah that's given to all of Israel, but a mitzvah about Pesach, a communal celebration, a marked date on the calendar. It's the reference point for our entire people. He forgot about proclaiming freedom. He forgot about actualizing what it means to believe in something. Maybe he didn't forget that he himself was free, but he forgot about his responsibility to remember and to tell that story and to live his life in that way. He forgot the first mitzvah in the entire Torah that is addressed to the collective body as a whole. So what's the role of memory and our responsibility to it? How do we retain it? Is it about book learning and study? Yup, of course it is. But it's also about being a part of a collective. Let's go to the end of the story. The sages asked for God to have mercy on him, and his learning was restored. How is his learning restored? They don't remind him of what he forgot. They don't send him to school. Instead, there's a communal ritual. His colleagues pray to God for his well-being, and as a result, just as quickly as he lost his knowledge, it comes back to him. They don't critique him. They don't try to fix his error. They just want to have compassion for him in this moment. They don't exile him away. They don't scorn him. They have empathy. And there's, I want to say, as I was revisiting this and thinking about this, I actually, this is a moment when I think lots of us, I'll speak for myself. It's very easy for me to look at people who understand October 7th differently than I do, and for me to say to them, like, you have willingly exiled yourself from our community. I'm just speaking for myself. It's very easy to do that. And it's interesting here to look at a model, a very ancient model of us, of rabbis also dealing with a traumatic memory, who could have done that. And instead what they do is they ask for God to have compassion and to restore a sense of what it means to be a part of the collective. And there's a model here also, I think, for how we can approach people who have experienced these kinds of trauma. I try very hard not to diagnose historical figures with psychological conditions, but you get a sense that maybe like Rabbi Elazar ben Arach kind of has PTSD. He's like, he can't remember who he is. So the takeaway might be that it's possible not everybody processes memory in the same way, right? And sometimes there's circumstances beyond our control, and that we understand traumatic events at different speeds. And what do the rabbis do? They kind of get that, right? They have empathy for him. So altogether, the Talmud has shown us the hazards of separating yourself from the collective memory, right? But if it's the community and the collective that's of value, it's also encouraging us not to sacrifice that in the name of reprimanding someone. Right? The rabbis don't want to push him away even further. So the story completely ends with this denouement, and there's a strong moral. And that is why we learned, Rabbi Noraim says, exile yourself to a place of Torah, and don't say that it will follow you, as if your colleagues will just establish it in your hands, and do not rely on your understanding alone. So, having examined the parallel texts which juxtapose Rabbi Elazar with his colleagues and show him just sitting around futilely waiting for them to come to him, now we can appreciate the injunction here against such idle behavior, right? Don't say that it will come to you as if your colleagues will come and put it in your hands, and don't rely on your understanding alone. It's a communal endeavor. The collective plays a role in the life of the individual, and the individual plays a role in the life of collective. And Pirkei Avot here closes by quoting a text from Proverbs, right? Don't rely on your understanding alone. This is basically the entire idea behind Chavruta learning, right? This is like this indigenous Jewish pedagogy. We don't learn on our own. We always learn with somebody else. You can read a book and learn on your own, but like the Jewish way of learning is to learn with at least another person. And remember that the Talmud has been thinking about this in the context of exile, right? The exile of the 10 lost tribes. And the story ends with an entirely different idea of exile, one that's actually advocated, right? Wherever you're going in life, it should be to a place of Torah. And if that place is not Yavne, either the literal city or the kind of figurative representation of a place of learning, then you should still surround yourself with other learners. Right? And that not being in a community of fellow learners is seen as a form of spiritual exile that will cause you to forget not just your learning, but also your sense of collective identity. So for me now, I want to say just a few closing ideas on this. One is that I don't think that this story from the Talmud is saying, get rid of all foreign influence. I don't think it's saying. I also don't think it's saying, don't ever, ever, ever seek out pleasure or want to enjoy yourself. I don't think it's saying that. I think instead that there's a deep awareness here of, like, on a philosophical level, what it means to be a hedonist, right? To be someone who's always looking to satisfy your own personal wants before the collective needs, right? In a selfish and self-directed way. And the contrast of that in this story is a life of expanded self-awareness beyond you and your own personal worldly needs. That's why Elazar forgets his knowledge when he's away from community, because he was focusing on what he wanted just for himself. He forgets how to read Torah. He forgets his connection to our people's grandest narrative. And it only comes back to him when he's back in the place surrounded by people who can advocate on his behalf. All of these people, the Torah and the Bible and the prophets and the rabbis, they're all asking variations of these questions. What happened in the past and how do we understand it? What's going to happen in the future and what will the consequences be? And what's our responsibility to consider that, both in thoughts, right, how we think about learning and community, and then to actualize it in action together. This is the message of this season. It's how we've always understood how to grapple with particularly painful memories. And this active idea of memory, how it reflects the choices we make and our understanding of obligation and our understanding of our ethics towards each other, is also captured really beautifully in one last parallel text. Really, it's a parallel tradition. It's a teaching by David White, who's an Anglo-Irish poet. So not in the Talmud. What does he say? And we'll close with this. We actually inhabit memory as a place of choice and volition and imagination, a crossroads where our future diverges accordingly to how we interpret, or perhaps more accurately, how we live the story we inherit. Shana Tova, Gemar Tov. Thank you.
Rabbi, I'll schlep the mic to anybody you identify with a question. Maybe I could just start by saying, I doubt there's anybody in the room who does not know or love an individual suffering from dementia or, God forbid, Alzheimer's disease. It's not a new problem.
Yeah.
What have we learned over thousands of years about that fracture of memory and that loss as we try to retain our Judaism and our sense of it?
I'm so glad you asked that. I was aware at the time, so I cut out as we were going. See if I can find the source. If not, I'll just try to remember. Yeah, the short of it is the rabbis are really sensitive to that in our tradition. And they're aware at the time, again, like I don't know what terminology we would use, but the rabbis are certainly aware that as you get older, your memories change, right? And your grasp of them changes. And the rabbis are really beautiful about this, and I think in many ways really advanced compared to us. And they say you don't change how you treat those people at all. Just because somebody can't remember something because they're growing older, you still afford them all of the dignities and the righteousness that are obligated to everybody. And that, I just want to hold on to that for a second. The story that we looked at today is just one story, and it's like a very short story, right? But I feel as though it provides like such a strong moral foundation in our tradition that it is to have that on the one hand to say like, don't ever forget, don't ever go to a place that's going to make you forget all of this important stuff. So you would think like, oh, so we must view people who forget things rather negatively. And they say the exact opposite. They say, no, you're getting old, right? There's an understanding that things change in our capacities, and they are unequivocal in the respect and honor that is to be afforded to elders, right? Which just like really, I want to like put a pin on this. I think we fail that in exceptional ways in our societies. In Israel, the bus, if you ride the bus in Israel, at the front of the bus, it says, I'm on the spot and I'm going to forget. The short of it is here when you ride the bus and it says like these seats are reserved for elders. In Israel, it's a verse from the Torah, particularly about like the honor and the kavod, the respect that's due to elders. I mean, that comes very, very deeply in our tradition. Thank you for asking.
Your name, please.
Leah Davis.
can we see ritual as behavioral memory? And we may not remember the words that our behaviors signal to us our years, our relationships, and our beliefs. And so there are many different ways of remembering rather than only relying on intellectual.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. Yes, and I think it's the story. When Elazar ben Arach comes back and has lost his memories, what do his colleagues do? They don't like feed him the right way to pronounce the Torah. They do ritual, right? They pray with each other, and it's an embodied act rather than an intellectual act. I will go to whoever. Am I in charge?
All right, here's a letter.
Right, and Jerry, also you have your hand.
So as you were telling the story, I couldn't help but think about ultra-Orthodox communities that choose to separate themselves from the wider, larger, secular, or just as religious communities. Is that desire to be separate from an outgrowth of this story or perhaps other stories that are in the Talmud?
I'm not a sociologist. That's a good read of the text. It comes from somewhere, right? Like that behavior comes from somewhere. Yeah, I share that. I don't think that this text is, well, what you didn't look at are like all the other texts in the story of like the rabbis having just a fabulous time with the baths. Like, have you ever been to a Greco-Roman bath? It's lovely, right? Especially if you live in like the Middle East, which is cold in the winter and like very hot in the summer. It's like a very nice place to go to. And the rabbis know that. And they're like, there are other rabbinic texts where I can't remember which rabbi, other rabbi in the room, who's like hanging out at the baths, and someone says like, I think it's Akiva, who we met right here. Like Akiva's having a great time at the Schwitz, and another rabbi, or maybe Hill, I don't know. And another rabbi was like you're hanging out under a statue of Dionysus. Like, what's up with that? And he's like, it's just art. I sound flippant, but that's the moral of the story in the Talmud. It's like, it's not my God, it's just art, and it's nice, and I like it, and the bath is nice. So I could point to just as, and I'm looking at this through like a small L liberal worldview of like trying to find a critical balance of understanding here. But we all pick and choose, right? You could just as easily read this story as being, absolutely fundamentalist. Don't encounter secular culture whatsoever. Sure, you can. And I'm sure people.
Jerry has.
Hi, I'm Jerry Nielsen. I just a comment, and then I have a question from the Zoom. But what you just said, Jesse, reminds me of that ruin in Israel of a synagogue that has astrological signs in the floor. But anyway, this is a question from early on in your talk from Bernie Kolodner, who says, did the 10 lost tribes actually go to Turkey, or is their Hellenization metaphorically described as going to Turkey?
I don't know. Yeah. Well, they're lost for a reason, right? There's some, by the way, if this is not something you should go home and Google on your own. If you go home and Google 10 lost tribes, you'll see so much junk archaeology. And please don't do that if that's the only thing you take away. But the latter, I think, oh, totally, right? It's a polemic against kind of the Hellenizing influences. Why? Because these people are occupied by the Romans, and they're very afraid, rightfully so. By the way, that's the other, right, Roberta, the flip of it is like, they're not just like a bunch of xenophobes and bigots. Like, they had very good reason to be afraid of Rome. I'm Canadian, right? Live next door to America. Like, we talk about cultural hegemony, right? Like, that's what they're experiencing. So it's not misplaced, right? The question is, what do you do with that awareness? Over that way again.
Thanks so much. This was absolutely stunning learning. I'm Francie Schwartz, and your title really grabbed me. from memory to oblivion, which made me think of something a little wider. Can you have an individual memory? Can you have a memory by yourself, or is really memory all collective? At least for us, the Jews.
So the learning which I prepared to you emerged from my rabbinic thesis, and one of the greatest things I learned from my thesis advisor, Rabbi Paikin, Zichrono Livracha, is be very careful of overstating what the Talmud is saying. Right? I was, a little bit younger and like very precocious. The Talmud says this, and you'd be like, "Oh, what are you talking? Have you read the whole thing?" It's very big. It's like 6,000 pages. So I say that because I want to hedge what I'm about to say very carefully. No, I don't think that you can just do Judaism on your own with your own memories. So, yeah. I think I'm okay saying yes. Yeah. We're not, while there are ascetic trends within Judaism, right, while they have come and gone over the ages of like, I'll just go out and sit in the desert and commune with God on my own. Either those people died off because they were sitting out in the desert alone, or they weren't appealing because kind of everybody knows, no, you got to do it together, right? It has to be done together. Yes, I feel confident. Mm-hmm.
John Sirocco. The references to Hellenization can be negative, but I know that there were Jewish communities that were Greek-speaking communities. So was it all negative, or were there's
Oh no, it's definitely not all negative. I mean, look. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Who's the first of them? Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. He's got a Greek name, right? So clearly, right, his dad's name is Hyrcanus. So clearly it's not all that bad. Actually, there's other places in the Talmud where Greek, the language, is described as being the most beautiful of languages. So again, this was just one snapshot and one view. Jerry, you mentioned that Greek art and mosaic can be found. You can go see it today in Sipori, right? Zodiacs on the ground. It's a question, I think, though, of like what when you get a broad read of how the rabbis of the Talmud understand non-Jewish culture, it's one of, I would say, like ambivalence. Right? They kind of want to take the good parts of it, but they're also afraid of kind of the hegemony that's there and the threat that it poses. By the way, I wasn't flippant when I made like the Canadian joke about America. Like in Canada, we have something called CanCon laws, which are Canadian content, and Canadian television and radio have to play a certain proportion of Canadian content. Otherwise, they'll lose their license. Why? Because we live next door to America. And like I want the benefits of American culture. I like American music and American TV, right? But there's a flip to that of like, well, you can kind of forget yourself and who you are also, right? And so I think the rabbis are very much kind of in there also. Like, yeah, I like this, I like that the Romans brought us roads. The roads are great. And internal plumbing is awesome. I like that. And the art is lovely. But the circus and, the gladiators, I'm not so sure about that. But, the road leads to the arena. So what do you do, right?
Hi, I'm Helen Epps, and this is sort of a comment that ties back to Sid's initial comment, which is one of the ways we now know while we wait for science to bring us meditation, to try and hold on is to avoid social isolation, interact with other people. And, here we have the rabbi going and sitting alone with his wife and the mice. And I just wonder if there might have been some recognition, not just about study with others, but with interaction with others, which helps to preserve memory.
What a great, thank you for noticing that, and for sharing that. Sometimes I think you have to hold like two perspectives in tension while reading this text, which is probably around 2,000 years old. One is it couldn't be more different of a world than the world we're in, so we have to be very careful about retrojecting our opinions and values onto the rabbis because it's a very different place. And also, it's not that different, right? They're human beings, right? These are real human people, and in lots of cases, they knew better than we did.
Jerry has a question.
Here's a Canadian comment. Jesse, this is from your mom.
You weren't joking, see?
We learned that one of the worst things that can happen to a Jew is for their name to be forgotten. We all have the responsibility to remember each other in the present and pass the memories down the door by door. It's a beautiful confluence of individual and community.
Just trying to give my mom the honor of not having her teach that for a minute. Can you read that again, just the beginning?
Okay. We learn that one of the worst things that can happen to a Jew is for their name to be forgotten. We all have the responsibility to remember each other in the present and pass the memories down the door by door. It's a beautiful confluence of the individual and the community.
Yeah. Right. None of this is to say that like you should lose your own, like you should totally sublimate your own self to everybody else, right? Like you are still you as an individual. What I love about that is this story from Pirkei Avot that I brought, one of the parallel texts. You probably actually know the beginning of this, which is not quoted here, but it's the very famous saying that every person has three names or three crowns, right? Like 4 crowns, the crown of like sovereignty, the crown of priesthood, the crown of something else, but the crown of a good name outweighs them all, right? That's actually from here, from this story about Rabbi Elazar ben Ara, right? This association of kind of how will you be remembered, right? Now, was that on purpose? Did the authors of these texts do that? No, but this is one of the beautiful things where we can just kind of accept that and take that as